Today we're talking about Chapter 4, Section 2, which is an overview of photosynthesis. Before we get started, make sure that you have the corresponding Power Notes sheet. This has a place for you to keep track of information as we go, and more importantly, it has diagrams so that you can use these diagrams to really make sure you understand the material. So if you don't yet have that downloaded, pause the video and then come back and pick up where you left off. So we're talking about photosynthesis for one main reason, and that reason is that every organism needs energy to survive. We learned about that in our characteristics of life. Everything has metabolism, and that metabolism is based on the energy needs of those organisms. So we will discuss two categories of organisms. Some of them are called autotrophs, and they are responsible for converting energy from sunlight into food. And then other organisms called heterotrophs are going to have to consume food in order to meet their energy needs. No matter what kind of organism we're talking about, if we trace that energy all the way back to its original source, however, that original source for everything on Earth is always the sun. So let's talk about autotrophs. Autotrophs are any kind of organism that are able to produce their own food. Most of the time, this is through the process of photosynthesis, which if you think about the parts of the word, photo meaning light and synthesis meaning to put something together or to build it, that tells you that photosynthesis is a process that uses light to build molecules. Now, some autotrophs are chemosynthetic, using chemical energy to build their food molecules. We'll talk a little bit more about those next semester when we learn about the diversity of life. So we talked about photosynthesis. Now let's make sure we understand the word autotroph. If we break that down to its word parts, auto means self and troph means food. So an autotroph is literally a self-feeder, or something that's able to make food within its body. Now, when I say food, I am mostly talking about carbohydrates. That is the main energy source for the cells of all living things. And autotrophs are making carbohydrates through photosynthesis, and then everything on Earth is going to be using those carbohydrates that would eat a plant or eat an animal that has eaten a plant. Since autotrophs are making their own food, you will often hear them called producers. A producer is a synonym to being an autotroph. You could use those terms interchangeably. Now, plants are obviously the main example, and we saw pictures of those on the last slide. I did want to mention some other autotrophs like bacteria that you see in this image at the top. There are some types of bacteria called cyanobacteria or blue-green algae that are photosynthetic. That would make them an autotroph. Also, things like protists. Not all protists, but some of them, like this euglena that you see in a picture here, they are also photosynthetic. Now, a protist is just a general term for mostly single-celled organisms that swim around in pond water. So a lot of them are photosynthetic. They have chloroplasts inside of their single cell, and they can be considered autotrophs. A heterotroph is an organism that cannot make its own food. Let's look at that word and break it down. Hetero means other, troph refers to food. So heterotroph feeds on other organisms. And you can see that illustrated in the picture here of the toucan that's feeding on that frog. So the toucan would be a heterotroph. The frog also is actually a heterotroph. All animals are heterotrophs, because animals must consume other organisms as their food source. So that means a heterotroph could sometimes be called a consumer. Other examples of heterotrophs that you may not think of would be something like a fungus, this mushroom that you see pictured here. That is a heterotroph. It's not photosynthetic, it's not a plant. It actually digests the dead and rotting material that it's growing in. It secretes enzymes and breaks things down outside of the mushroom and then soaks it up through its root-like structures. Up here we have a different kind of protist. This clear blob is an amoeba, and an amoeba is a heterotrophic protist. you can actually see it is engulfing, it's surrounding and swallowing up this smaller green cell here. So this smaller green cell, since it's green, that's a clue to me that this would be photosynthetic. So this little green one would be an autotroph, and the big clear blob of the amoeba is the heterotroph. And then finally, most of the bacteria species are going to be heterotrophs. They have to take in nutrients and food from their surroundings rather than manufacturing it on their own. So the process of photosynthesis happens, obviously, we're focusing on plants here. It happens inside the leaf of the plant. And inside that plant leaf, there are plant cells that look something like this. And inside of a plant cell, there are smaller parts called organelles. And the organelle that's most important in photosynthesis would be the chloroplast. It looks like this down here in the very bottom of this diagram. And so inside of a eukaryotic cell that can undergo photosynthesis, you will find many chloroplasts within that cell. If we look at the internal structure of a chloroplast, there's a few key components that we need to discuss because it really is important for how the organelle can function. Our first component is that it has an outer membrane as well as an inner membrane. So this is a double membrane bound organelle. You can see in the diagram here, there's that darker green outer membrane and the lighter green inner membrane of a chloroplast. There are flattened discs called thylakoids. And those thylakoids are stacked up into a structure, and those structures are called grana. So this entire stack, it looks like a stack of coins. That would be one granum, that's the singular form, and there are multiple grana, or multiple stacks, inside of that chloroplast. The fluid interior, the jelly-like cytoplasm, so to speak, of a chloroplast is called the stroma. So we have double membranes, we have interior flattened discs called thylakoids. They're stacked up into structures called grana, and then they are all floating in the liquid called the stroma. Now, one other really interesting thing about chloroplasts is that they actually have their own DNA and ribosomes, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in our next unit. So you'll notice that chloroplasts are normally drawn as green structures, and that's because they're actually green in real life. They get their color from the green pigment chlorophyll. Chlorophyll plays a really important role in photosynthesis because it's a pigment, and what a pigment does is it absorbs certain wavelengths of light. Whatever it doesn't absorb, it is reflecting, and when it reflects those wavelengths back to our eyes, that is the color that we see. So when you think about chlorophyll, don't get confused. It is reflecting green and sometimes yellow light, but it is absorbing all of this red and orange and blue and violet. So chlorophyll can only absorb certain colors of light, and the colors that it can't absorb, the color it is reflecting to our eyes, gives it its characteristic green shade. Chlorophyll is not the only photosynthetic pigment. There are other pigments as well. We call these accessory pigments, and they have a really important role in a plant. They are able to absorb other wavelengths of light. We said chlorophyll can absorb a lot of the blues and the reds, but it reflects the green and the yellow. Well, other accessory pigments can absorb the green and yellow light. So if we look at this diagram down here, it's showing you what wavelengths of light are absorbed by all of these different kinds of pigments. So you can see the peak means a high absorption. So if it has a high absorption in one range, that means chlorophyll B, for example, is absorbing a lot of this blue color. So if a plant has a lot of different pigments, notice that it has a peak in just about every range here of light that it could be absorbing, and that is going to maximize the amount of light absorbed by the plant. It also could have the added benefit of offering protection from UV light, kind of like a sunscreen for the plant's leaf. Now, you have definitely seen accessory pigments before if you have seen leaves change color in the fall. The reason why they do this is because that green chlorophyll that's normally so common in a plant cell, it starts to break down when the season changes. And when the chlorophyll breaks down, it leaves behind all of those accessory pigments so we can start to see their color. We see the reds and the oranges and the gold colors show up. Those pigments were always in the leaf, but when the chlorophyll breaks down, now we can finally see those other colors for the other accessory pigments. So the reason why chlorophyll and those other pigments are so important, again, remember, a pigment, what it does, it absorbs energy. And if you look at the chemical equation for photosynthesis, energy is required for photosynthesis to take place. You need light energy, you need your reactants of CO2, which is carbon dioxide, and H2O, which is water. They combine together to make glucose, C6H12O6, and then they release oxygen, O2 gas, as a byproduct. So notice how the CO2, it's color-coded red, it's becoming incorporated into that glucose. And the water that's color-coded blue, it's actually being split during the process of photosynthesis. So you see it goes into two different places. We have hydrogen here in that glucose molecule, and then the oxygen from water has been split off, and this is what is released as oxygen gas. So definitely at this point in time, you should study this overall equation for photosynthesis, and you should certainly be familiar with it and be able to recognize it and be able to write it out from memory. Now, if we look at that equation and relate it to what's going on inside of that chloroplast, here you see a diagram that has the inner structure of a chloroplast, and we are looking at the steps of photosynthesis. There are two major stages of photosynthesis. We are going to go into more detail about this a little bit later. In your textbook, this will be in the next section. It's in section 3 of chapter 4. But for right now, let's just focus on the fact that photosynthesis does occur in two different stages, and those stages are called the light-dependent reactions, just like the name says, that depends on light. This is where light is used in photosynthesis. This would be the first stage up here. Everything above that gray line, those are the light-dependent reactions. We require the input of sunlight into that thylakoid right there. And notice the thylakoid is green. That is where all that chlorophyll is contained. The thylakoid structure contains chlorophyll. H2O is going into this first stage. O2 is being produced as a byproduct. And this first stage produces energy, which will be used later in the second stage. The second stage is the light-independent reactions. In the light-independent reactions, that's when the glucose is actually made. This is when the plant is going to take in CO2 and incorporate it into organic molecules and produce glucose. Now, it's called the light-independent reactions because in stage 2, light is not technically necessary. It can happen in the light or the dark. Light is not directly involved in the process. However, the energy from the light-dependent reactions, that energy is required for the light-independent reactions. So these generally both take place at the same time, and they generally both take place when there is light available. So I want to leave you here today with this section quiz for Chapter 4, Section 2. Go ahead and pause it on this slide. You should be able to read through these questions and come up with your answer. There is a place on your Power Notes sheet for you to write down what you think the answer is for all 5 questions. So do that, and then when you come into our next class meeting, make sure you have those written down and we can use that as a point for discussion. So hopefully you found this helpful, and as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.